Hello, and welcome back to Partnerships Unraveled, the podcast where we dive deep into the mysteries and secrets of partnerships and the channel. My name is Michal. I'll be your host for today, and I'm excited to sit down with Adam Winston from WatchGuard. Adam, how are you this early morning?
It's not bad. 24/7, 7 a.m. is not the worst time to get started. So, not super early for me, but I appreciate it. Glad to be here.
Amazing. Hey, the first thing I want to start off with is just a little bit about you. You've had a storied career. You have an interesting background. Could you give us a little bit of an introduction?
Yeah, I think, by way of starting a company, I think a lot of people would sort of say, what was your sort of secret? What was the success, arc? And I guess out of school, the idea was that I started a company with no particular vision in mind, just something around the realm of IT and cybersecurity. And, doing cold calls on my parents' carpet to try to, start to get revenue for that company with no product, no service, and a computer science degree that was barely, not even the certificate had shown up yet. And so the idea is that several years later, there was something to be proud of in the fact that we'd kind of grown to 25 people. We had around $12 million a year in revenue, and we did it without borrowing a dollar. We did it without any type of magical product, right? And this became, I guess, what people would call the MSP space, or what people would call resale, right? But the idea that you could very much run a very successful business just doing that. Now, you also run into a lot of different challenges there, right? There's this sort of very difficult step between $0 and $12 million, and that is having to partner with some of the biggest, scariest, most selective partner companies in the world, which are software and hardware companies that are pretty choosy in terms of who they pick as their partners, right? They have the world's global service providers. They have, giant companies like IBM, and all the good contracts either go direct or they go through those partners. And if you're a little guy with no clients, they're kind of like, what? You want to, you can have a partnership. Here's a little piece of paper. Call me when you sell something and I'll try to take it from you, right? And so the navigating of the just this big pressure to be like, okay, well, people are asking for and trying to buy the best, but they're also buying it from the biggest, right? You have this other aspect that, like, there's a bunch of other vendors out there, many of which are startups. Maybe their software doesn't really work. So there's this huge kind of balancing act you have to do with just picking partners, picking a story, and then getting people, frankly, to trust you over the phone, which is incredibly difficult when you're, a 24-year-old kid with not a single other reference customer in the world, right? So breaking through that is pretty difficult. And then once you get kind of to the other side, there's this plateau that hits a lot of companies around the 10 million mark. Everybody says your first million is one of the hardest million to make. I would disagree. I think you can make a very unprofitable, mixed bag, waste of time $1 million to say that you did it with a profit of 10%, doing all kinds of random things. And then, as you sort of rise up and try to actually have a business in and around 4 and 5 million or 10 million, it's much, much more difficult to break through to higher revenues, higher employee counts, and still maintain profitability and a real kind of momentum that you've built up to get to that place in the beginning. So very interesting story, I think, because it's the more common story, right? We read all the time about the, like, Series A, Series B, here's some money. They came up with a cool idea. They didn't have product market fit and they pivoted. That's like the engineer's version of a business, right? It's not really what most people in the world go through to run a business. Most businesses are family owned. Most businesses are less than 10 people. Most businesses have an existential crisis every few years to put them out of business. And so it's navigating that kind of problem that is much more common in the business world than the other one.
Yeah, well, something you just said made me think, like, yeah, you're competing with all these massive companies. You're competing for mind share. You're competing for them to even pick up the phone. How did you approach that? How did you break through that noise?
Yeah, early on, I realized there wasn't going to be a product differentiator. Right? You weren't going to walk in and say, like, "Oh, I'm selling a product that someone else isn't." Right? So you have this sort of commodity problem. You're selling hot dogs. The next guy's selling hot dogs. Okay, you try the entertainment factor. Can I be funnier? Can this be kitschy? People are frustrated by that, right? They don't. Nobody wants to. Yeah, yeah. Nobody wants to clown selling hot dogs, and they mean, like, this is food. I don't want you to touch it with makeup on. There's this this concept of, like, trying to make jokes over the phone, be charming, have a kitschy thing? What if I told you you never had to pay for cybersecurity? The hackers were going to pay, like just weird things that made no sense, right? And people don't have a lot of time for that. And I think what broke through for me, at least, and what made sense was to say, okay, well, I'm not going to be able to stand on my own credibility. I'm going to have to do something that is probably a little bit different and say, well, there's credibility of others who I'm going to staff on this project. And so what I would do to start, and this took me 3 or 4 months of calling about 100 calls a day just to figure this out, was to say, okay, well, they're never going to trust a kid. Why would you? With something as crazy sensitive as cybersecurity, even a small company wouldn't be interested in doing that, right? And so the math after calling your friends and your family and everybody else and begging and borrowing for favors and doing everything you can to debase yourself on the phone is to then turn around and say, hey, I've got this PhD, call center designer who worked at Cisco and worked at, Bell Labs. He is currently an adjunct professor looking to, design a new call center. Would you be interested in a project where we could develop your call center? And I got a telco who had tried to staff for this call center build out, had basically said, okay, we don't have enough people in house. We are using, let's call them recruiters to do this. We could do this project thing. And they're like, look, kid, we're not going to pay anything more than 15% of the salary for this recruiting job. And I'm like, you're going to pay 15% of the salary. And so I literally ran out. I'm like, I got five more. And then, yeah, they hired four out of the five. And that obviously with about $150,000 per person, that 15% really kicked in. That was my first big deal. And that's when I got my first check and realized how much the government takes off the check and was like, oh, I need to be doing a lot more than this. This is not a lot. I can't live off of this. It's worse than minimum wage. But the math there was that there was a different arc that you could take into getting trust, because it really is about trying to sell trust, and you can't sell trust without a brand. You can't sell trust without experience. You can't just say I'll work hard. They're like, that doesn't mean anything if you don't know what you're doing, right? So you do have to build on the credibility somehow, and that's how I did it, at least
Yeah,
to start.
especially in a complicated domain, it's almost like utilizing thought leadership within that process, right? I think that's a really smart approach, especially because you're proving that that person trusts you enough to work with you, and therefore you've got a better proposition to your prospects. I think that's a really smart approach.
Right. In some ways, I was kind of it was diminishing my own contribution to the game, because it was basically saying like, look, I know nothing. You hear salespeople say this all the time. I know enough to be dangerous, but I've got really smart people with me who are going to do this. Right. And it's such a it's a cheesy tactic. But it does work, because then you're not speaking on behalf of some IP contact center Cisco product you've never installed before, and understanding how latency and jitter affect call center, voice stuff and stuff I never knew at the time. I had a CCNA or whatever that I read on the weekend, right? Like, this is not the kind of guy you want designing, lossless phone calls on your network. So coming back to that, that other skill is really important, right?
Yeah.
Other people's skills.
That's an incredible journey. So, just to recap, you've scaled a tech company from basically your basement to 12 million in annual revenue. You've gone through a successful M&A. Now you're field CTO at a global security vendor. Now, throughout all of that, what's a painful truth about building channel businesses that people you've seen only learn the hard way?
I think that when you look at trying to develop your business through a channel, you suffer the same problem I did. Calling the big companies, they want to work with the big companies. They want the big badges. The channel wants to buy the best in the business, and they want their customers to, be the ones driving, hey, we need more, right? Like, that's most of the time when you go to the customer and say, it's really difficult to prospect, to call a customer and say, hey, would you be interested in this weird product nobody else has, that's a designed, from, some country that isn't this one. Like, it gets to the point where, they're not going to waste their cycles, because they know how valuable each one of those interactions is with their clients. So they want almost every visit to be a hit. Hey, what project are you working on? We can be a part of that. Would you be interested in our version of the solution? And so this kind of like, whiteboard portfolio selling, where you have this big line card, is how a lot of people are sort of driven. And when you're calling, I guess, from the vendor side, or trying to be in the middle, when the vendors are calling you, you do get your hackles up when they're like, oh, okay, we got this new antivirus, or we got this new, firewall, we got this new thing. So a hard truth is that the incumbents, and I'm being on a 30-year incumbent side now, being on the WatchGuard side, you see how valuable that brand that you've built over 30 years is. It's never for nothing, right? The idea is that you now have mind share, trust. You talk to them all the time about their renewals, about their refreshes, about their business, about their profits. That's something you could never do before as a startup, right? So one of the painful truths coming from, I'd say, the sort of Act Zero channel world into the WatchGuard channel world is just how much, honestly, respect they give you the time. They used to say this all the time when you get a rep. It's like when you walk in with an IBM or a Cisco or a Deloitte business card, they listen to you. The customer takes your call, right? And that's true here. So it's a hard truth to say that, like, at WatchGuard, when you have a partner that's lasted for a decade, you do get them to answer the phone. You do get to walk into the room and demonstrate the portfolio. They give you the opportunity, and they look at it with a, okay, I could add that here, I could add that there. It's almost like a contractor's already renovating your kitchen, getting, the cabinets too or something. It's just it's a much more frictionless motion. And I
Yeah.
feel like a lot of companies waste that. They have these channel opportunities and they sell them weird, maybe new, maybe underperforming things. It kind of reminds you of like the restaurateur that's like, the fish is about to turn. Let's go flip them the salmon tonight. Yeah, and you're getting the crap product, so, like, you never want to abuse that relationship, but it's a very hard truth that without that, it's much, much more difficult to get people to listen to what you're saying, and frankly, if you don't have anything to sell, there's almost nothing else to talk about, right? Like, "Thank you for buying Box. I hope you enjoy Box," right? Like, there's not a lot else in the suite that you're gonna give them over at Box. No, not to Box, but yeah.
I got you. Yeah. Have you ever heard of the term sonder?
No.
It's a
Saunter,
word.
yes.
Sonder. No, sonder.
Sonder.
Sonder. No,
Okay.
it's a word I recently heard for the first time, and it applies to this quite directly. And it's the realization that everyone around you isn't just like an extra in your own life, but they
Oh,
each
the
have.
first person energy? Okay,
Yeah,
yeah.
but they, like,
Alright.
all have rich, full lives of their own, and I think this applies as well to kind of the vendor-partner relationship. While we were prepping for this, podcast, we talked about how easy it is to, like, develop blind spots when it comes to the reality that many MSPs live with, like low margins, limited engagement, trying to survive in this constantly challenging landscape. So how should vendors then rethink partner engagement if they do want to support these MSP or like these SMB focused MSPs as opposed to doing the our salmon is going to turn, let's put it on the specials board kind of approach?
Yeah, I mean, almost every interaction you should start with not trying to talk about yourself, right? I think one of the guilty, every product marketing team that comes in, like, here's the slide. We've been around for 30 years. We have a red box. It's shiny. We've got this customer, that customer. We give to charity. Look at this cute dog I have. This is ridiculous, selfish energy. It's almost like reverse Saunders to say, like, look,
Yeah.
if you're not putting yourself in the head of the person, if you're just walking in there with main character energy, being like, you know what they're going to want to hear about? It's everything I got to say. You're wasting a tremendous amount of time and a very valuable thing. And every time you start, every one of those points you're making, you're starting to lose people big time where they just want out. They're like, by 3 o'clock, I could actually be having lunch at the Greek place downstairs. I don't really need to be, doing this, right? The math there is that we're never really talking, especially technology companies, super guilty of this. We think the tech is so incredible. We just start blabbering on about the tech, and these partners, these managed service providers, of which many of whom are basically sitting there with some of them 10% margin on their deals, some of them customers who cannot spend another dollar. The dentist office has kind of solidified a package with them for 2 or 3 years to say, you're going to manage my Wi-Fi and IT, and I don't know anything about tech, so don't come in here and try to sell me more stuff, right? They didn't even have the premise, many cases, to say, like, hey, by the way, so that you know, technology in it is going to grow broadly, and it's going to grow in the depth here for you as your business matures and as technology changes. So we're going to have to come in with different stuff. So there's kind of like there's almost no future proofing of some of these contracts in the customer's mind. Then the MSP's caught in the middle. So there's this really difficult sort of thing that nobody's ever really talking about, which is their profitability, which is how much the annualized recurring revenue will multiply the value of their business, right? Most businesses, if you're an MSP business, so one time your contract value before 6 times the annualized recurring revenue if there's a healthy EBITDA in there, if there's healthy, cheaper word for margin, let's say, like good money left over, right? So if you have this concept of like a beautiful rolling snowball of annualized recurring revenue, you have this very sellable company. And trust me, I've tried to sell the company that didn't have that, and I tried to sell the company that did have that. And on the one hand, you feel like it's a yard sale. You're giving things away for pennies on the dollar in the one-time revenue world. In the other one, you almost can't believe that they're giving you 4x. You're like, this is an incredible, value multiplier for me. It's a great, financial setup for me in my life. And if you're telling people that, there's a lot more to your story than, hey, I got a red box and it's better than the blue box, right? And at WatchGuard, that was, I think, one of the greater unlocks is to walk in here and finally see this. You can tell people have been around 30 years that kind of came to those clues themselves. You sort of walk into the company and they're like, they're already talking that way, right? They already have this concept of like, we really are managing our profit, the margins of our customer. We're managing the sell books that they go and use to grow their business. We're showing them how complementary and how simple it is to grow their business with adjacent products into different bundles that they're going to offer their customers, as opposed to like, you can use this for that. No, it comes as always part of a package. And if you think about like early stage Microsoft and late stage Microsoft, the power of the bundle is like second to none, right? If you think about, you're on Teams, why are you on Teams and not Slack or Zoom? It's the bundle. It's not the product, right? It's the bundle. So, and understanding that customers buy that way and that partners sell that way and that everybody is sort of working that way in this industry, it's an incredibly powerful mechanism, but does start with not main character energy talking about yourself, focusing on the cut, what that poor MSP is going through and making them a rich MSP that's going through it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fascinating perspective because I can imagine that when you're an MSP, sometimes it feels like you just have to sell, right? But having that more long-term vision, thinking about the bigger picture and really kind of taking those steps towards this higher recurring revenue and focusing on EBITDA just in general. I know that's not a mindset some companies have, and I think that's tricky to get in because if it does feel like you're struggling, you're focusing on tomorrow. You're not focusing on let's say next year. Do you have any tips on like how you can shift that mindset?
I think part of it is that I mean, some of these guys aren't accountants, right? So when you get into the business and you're a technician, you're a technology person, you don't know a lot about finance or accounting, it's hard to let that drive your decisions, but it must, right? Like these are the truths that just,
Yep.
I've seen so many companies, some of my best friends' companies, go under because they just couldn't honestly do difficult things when the time came. They didn't set up their businesses for recurring revenue. They didn't have a healthy profit. They couldn't make very good calculated decisions. And then they'd run over on labor and have to let go of their friends, or you'd see these horrifying stories of people sacrificing. Every time you watch like one of these reality shows about like a restaurant or something and they're in super huge financial trouble, they've like mortgaged the house and gone into credit card debt trying to like keep the lights on for a restaurant that is just not performing, right?
Yep.
And it's because they really didn't, work through the financial math to say, yeah, this was going to be an eventuality unless we had predictable revenue from some income source that was going to give us a margin enough that we could actually relax and actually work on the business instead of in the business, right? There's such an entrepreneurial story is to sacrifice yourself when times are tough to do the install or to, stay up late on the weekends or do the Christmas holiday shift because you want to do it. I'm guilty of it. Everybody's guilty of it, right? They put themselves into the hot seat because they're like, well, I'm a leader. I should sacrifice. And you're like, well, if you're a leader, you should understand how this game is played so that you can be there for your people.
Yeah.
And so shifting the mindset from working in the business to on the business is an incredibly difficult thing to do because I think honestly, people will always trade effort and just say, if I trade effort, effort's always on the table and effort's going to keep me whole, right? Effort's the right thing to do. If I just put more elbow grease into this, then I should be bestowed with the success, right? Like it should happen. That's like a divine thinking. Like something's going to come here, Deus ex machina, and pull you out of the dirt when you were a good soul. And it's like I understand that trade better than anybody, but that's not the trade. The
Yeah.
trade was you have to set up a healthy business that can survive multiple contracts, lots of different diverse types of customers, not single, revenue focused, single vertical focused, good enough margin to keep your people employed and healthy employed. Because here's the other thing with small businesses. You have a really good, talented person and they might love you. And my staff loved me. I know this. We hang out well after they've been gone. But if Palo Alto comes and pays them 3 times the salary to work there, they're going to work there, right?
Yeah.
Like, love only goes, so you can't take my love to the bank and buy a new house, but you can take their money to the bank. So it's over, right? So, you have to prepare for, like, I have three good people, things are going great. What if all three left tomorrow for
Yeah,
a better salary?
it's almost like that a triangle of tactics, strategy, and empathy, right? Where you bring all those three things together, and that's when you can build success. And it reminds me of almost 10 years ago, which is kind of shocking to me. I was in an M&A trajectory where our scale up was being acquired by a larger corporate, and one thing I'm so incredibly grateful for is that my manager at the time told me, a product marketing guy then, "Hey, do you want to understand how this M&A works?" And I was just blown away, and it completely changed my perspective on working in an organization, working with other organizations. There's so many moving parts. There's so many things happening under the surface that are completely inscrutable if you don't have knowledge of this. So yeah, balancing those tactics of just doing the work with focusing on the bigger picture and sometimes making a what seems like a worse tactical decision to support the longer term strategic decision. It's really difficult, but it's incredibly valuable.
I think so. It's almost like no one ever talks about health issues, mental health
Mm.
issues. There's some things that have this stigma, and accounting within a business just happens to be this massive stigma. If we explain to people, and this is always the philosophy, if we explain to people how much money they're making, or what money we're making and for what reason, and move to like the here's the profit, here's the loss, here's the retained earnings, here's the value of the company, people assume that their employees will come out with knives out and be like, well, then we should get, this much bigger part of the pie. But there's so much value in ownership thinking that's distributed to the employees, that's given to them from the startups. They knew this immediately. You give them equity, you explain the cap table, you show that we raised this much money. Here's our spend table. Here's the objective key results. And they have this beautiful trick with startups because it's not their money, right?
Yeah.
With an owner operator, it's their money, right? Or their loan that's tied to their personal liability. So there's this risk that it's like, I'm deploying the capital, and then you get kind of this us versus them. In the startup, you have the beautiful, here's the capital. Everybody knows how it's distributed. We should do the best by this because if we exit, then there's this multiple to the shares that you all were given, right? In the M&A discussion with you, I bet one of the most striking, eye-opening things was a little bit of transparency into the accounting, right? A
Yes.
concept of saying, like, here's the multiples, here's the revenue, here's the profit, here's what that means to the buyer, here's what that means to the shareholder. As soon as you put a couple of those pieces in place, you can start to envelop the mind with a little bit more ownership thinking. And people will start to say, well, okay, well, now I know what all this is for. I know what these people are going for. That way, it's not like, oh, he's really angry at the end of Q4. He must be having a bad Christmas. It's like, no, we're having a terrible quarter. We had to have a run rate of 4 good quarters for this acquisition to go through. And now that's not going to happen. My valuation and your stock price just went down, right? So the idea that, like, there's ownership thinking that you have to bestow on people, the simplest way, I think, is to try to go through M&A. Now, the opposite can happen. This happened to me a couple of times. When there's a knock at the door from a fancy company and they start imagining themselves working there and that falls through, the attrition is huge because you've now got an expectancy violation. They imagine themselves in the consulting uniform, that they were going to go to the big building that we toured them through. And this is a classic mistake of the small getting acquired by the large, is that they will wine and dine you, and it's all champagne and roses about how great the big co is and how you're not going to have to struggle anymore. No more weekends, no more night shift, all this stuff.
All my
And then
budget.
you unlimited budget. Look at all we have a really good, coffee machine. Your coffee machine sucks, right? There's this element of, like, you just start dreaming about it. And what I ended up finding was, unless you actually have a ratified deal, if you're at, like, the letter of intent stage, trying to get ownership thinking by letting them in too much can completely backfire. Because then immediately, once Big Co decides they don't want you anymore for whatever, they found somebody else, they tucked in and bought somebody, whatever the thing is, where do all your employees now want to still work? And
Yeah.
kind of can, right? Like, there's a non-competition, but those aren't really enforced. So they just, all of them go, okay, well, I'll just go to Big Co anyway, because that was the plan and the dream, and so it could still work out for me. And
Yeah.
so there's a danger, I think, for these owner operators to try to do that when they don't have a good handle on it. But the risk is always worth the reward, in my experience, that you should include people, ownership thinking, much more transparent KPIs, OKRs. That plays a huge role in getting them to think about exactly what it is the company needs. And then they'll be inspired to start doing some things. Like, maybe we shouldn't have the Christmas party. We should put the money over here. where we'll all benefit in 6 months.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think engagement and ownership are such incredibly powerful tools. But one thing that I often see is that requires actually constant reinforcement and constant communication. And that dovetails into something we discussed in the prep call. And you mentioned being a fan of something you called the placemat strategy, basically putting the message right in front of people. Could you speak to this a little bit?
Yeah, after this conversation, and anybody who's listening to it will retain about 10% of the information the next day. And you have to operate on the assumption that that's true with every conversation you have. Like, they're not going to remember that you said, "Oh, I'm free at Christmas if you want to do that cycle class." You got to have this, like, some kind of leave behind, something that's more than just, every day, you put your brand on something that you use. My cable management, it says WatchGuard on it. The more effective thing, especially because a lot of these MSPs you're calling out, was what we put together was placemats. It's something that you just kind of put your coffee on, but it has the talk track, right? Because I come in, I say, okay, we got 12 products, we got 100 features, and we've got 65 competitives for each one of those things. So that loom of exploding things to memorize is very difficult. Okay, what was your thing about you're better than CrowdStrike or better than Sentinel One because you do what was the feature? Zero Trust. I forget the name, right? Like this, it's going to be very difficult. But you put it on a placemat. And then you have this concept that, as they're making the calls, as they're on the Zoom conversation, their eyes will just naturally drift downwards and they'll just start reading the memories to be like zero trust. They'll start circling it nervously with their pen, right? And so eventually you have this concept of saying, well, whatever was 10% now, maybe it's 25, 30, 40, 50%. Even if they're just looking at the technology name, the words, a picture of it, the
Yeah.
fact that it's now reinforced, really, really cool. And it's hard to do that because in your employees or your MSPs, space, right? There's not a lot. You see this always bothers me is the sticker on the back of the book, right? On the back of their laptop. That's good because then the customer is just going to inherently read what's on there. But it's always some cartoonish like snowboarding picture. It says like, Stowe, Vermont, and then it says McAfee at the same time. And you're
Yeah.
like, okay, so he's like a kind of a rocker guy. Like just this like bizarre collage, right? So there's so much real estate that you're not in control of that if you had a cool sticker, I don't think it works as well. But something like a placemat, it does a lot.
Yeah, so it's really about that getting the most out of every single interaction you have, basically using every trick in the book. And they're not really tricks, right? They're just inherent ways of speaking to and with people that I think is really important. Um, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say that the trick aspect, it's just so much of this, it's kind of like there's a little bit of like, it's like a magic show, like, oh, good swag. It's the difference between swag and a tool to help you sell is you actually use one to help you sell, right? And so if
Yeah,
I look at like this concept of like when we put stuff in front of people, especially if it's like, t-shirts, hats, pens, books, whatever, the idea isn't just that they're going to use it, it's what they're going to use it for, right? And are you going to use this thing to help you sell something? Are you going to use this thing when you have a question? Are you going to use this thing to sort of represent what the brand is or demonstrate something? And to me, like that's a big part of it, right? The one of the cooler ones, this is way back in the day, was a company called Bromium, and it got acquired by Hewlett Packard. And they had a very interesting way of kind of stopping malware using sandboxing, but it was something that ran on your operating system instead of the cloud. Long story short, behind this, micro pitch, which most people wouldn't really understand, they had a cool little USB with a little pop top opener. On the USB was two things. It was their software, and it was a folder called malware. And it was all the worst malware that they had. And they would slide the keys at the end of the presentation to the engineers and go, now, how many of y'all are confident that if you plug the USB key and run the malware folder, you're going to be fine? And how many of you would like to run our software and run the malware folder then to show you that we know you're fine, right? And so it was like people were started scrambling for the keys. They loved the idea, but it's because of what they were going to use it for. They were going to use it to prove that the software really did what they said it was going to do. They could use it to run the toy and see not, a blinking lights little, moving puppy. It was real, right? So like things like that, I think have a really nice uh, effect on people when it comes to trying to set up what they can remember the next day. Because the day after that, what do you think the guys remember? Do you think they remembered the slides, the name of the products, anything? They hold up the key and they go, do you know what's on this key? And it becomes this whole thing. So yeah, the placemat strategy, the key strategy, these are all just different strategies that I think embody the idea that you're doing something people are going to use and use to sell or use to test, right?
Yeah. Well, it's actually incredible because while you were talking, I was thinking of a giveaway that when I was at Cinch, this communications provider, we gave away at events, which is pretty much what you have with WatchGuard. It's a cable organizer, and the one response I got from everybody was, "I don't have this, and I need this." But it's true.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
incredible.
yeah,
But the one thing that you just mentioned about the USB stick, that's like a next level. It's where you almost gamify your pitch. Right? That's the
yeah.
way they're doing it because everybody has a USB key, but you basically transform the USB key into a tool, which I find a fascinating approach. And my mind's already spinning with like how am I gonna operationalize this for our next event? That's incredible. That's so cool.
Yeah, if you sell software, I mean, the number one way to get it into people's hands is for them to try it.
Yeah.
Can you give it a so like over here, if you go to the WatchGuard console, every single product we sell, you can hit trial, right? And it's self deploy, like it's just self deploys, right? The idea
Oh,
is that like there shouldn't be anything, nothing between you and trying the software to be like, oh, okay, I get it. Oh, I like it. I don't like it. Right. That's it. That's like to so many software providers. The fact you have to go through like 9 hoops. Call me for pricing is my favorite one. Like if
oh
you
yeah.
just have to go, you have to go through this huge chain of people. It's like, come on, just let me download it. Tell me how much it costs. And the most successful companies, you look at like our integration with like professional services automation tools, PSAs, right?
Yeah.
This is like the number one feature request for people is to say, hey, I on my PSA, I can see on Halo or whatever the Adobe Acrobat and how much it costs, and then click it and sell it to my customer. That's it, right? We're in that mode, right? Where like you go to Amazon to find out the price when you're in the store, right? So like people who are not living in the era we're living in when it comes to like pricing, sales, billing, trials, they're not going to be around much longer, right? Like the cloud kind of did this for like everything from wireless to firewalls a while back, where just making it easy to just plug something in and it phones home and you've got the whole thing set up through a
Yeah.
browser without any extra work at all. Now you can click the buttons, get the rest of the software. That's it. You can find out how much you need to pay for something and pay for it, right? Or change how you bill for it. Those are all things that I mean sounds so benign to a person who's used to using Amazon on the retail side or even eBay a million years ago, right? And so it's not like this is new ways of doing things. This is how people are used to working with tech now. More importantly, on the business side.
It's such a good point. And there again, we come back to Sonder, right? That we as sellers, so to speak, we kind of almost assume that everybody understands our go-to-market motion, which is not necessarily the case. They might have a totally
Or
different
cares.
or cares.
Yeah.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
I like contact me for pricing. What I also love is when you ask, oh, so what results can I expect? And you get, well, that's
No outcomes. Yeah.
it depends. It depends. It's a big red flag for me as well. Hey, I feel like we could talk about all this for hours, but I want to ask a couple more what I hope are salient questions. Um, the most important one being looking at your career trajectory, your arc, like you said, founder scars, M&A insights. You got a global field experience. Where would you see the biggest opportunity for the channel and for MSPs in, let's say, the next 3 to 5 years?
So very interesting 3 to 5. We're in the most interesting time in all of computer science where we're going to get a refactoring of almost every technology, whether they like it or not, using new science around how everything from structured data, query languages, we're moving from deterministic models to probabilistic models. It doesn't sound like it means much, but we're moving from a database to AI, right? And so this idea that like even something as simple as like what a file is might get refactored over the next 3 to 5 years changes the aspect, I think, of what an MSP can imagine themselves doing, right? For probably the last 30 plus years, an MSP really was just sort of a technician and handled the break fix, the labor arbitrage of the setup, the management, the maintenance, the coordination between different products. And for many organizations in cybersecurity, this is the biggest spend. If you look at $200 billion in cybersecurity, 50 billion is still spent on pro services. Tech takes up a very tiny tranche of that, right? That's left over, of which in cybersecurity firewall is still the dominant number one, and then it goes endpoint security, identity, and on down, right? And you have this kind of thinking of saying, well, okay, is that revenue bucket, total addressable market, is that going to still be the way it is. And AI is now about 4 or 5 years old, and we've been watching what it can and cannot refactor very quickly. We assume that it's going to refactor everything in the next 3 to 5 years, and so I think that the opportunity really is in that. If it's like if I turned around to you in 2004 and I drew the exact same picture around the internet build out, around like who's going to profit, Cisco, who's the most valuable company in the world at the time, or is it e-commerce apps that are going to be built on top of this layer? Most people would say I'm going to make a lot of money with the Cisco of our day. Nvidia, AI companies like OpenAI, it's 70% of the equities market. It should make a very clean and simple ways to say if I can attach myself to that, if I can work on getting close to that build out, I'm going to be successful. And I would argue it's the opposite. If history has taught us anything, Cisco wasn't the money. It was Facebook, it was Google, it was these companies that rose on top of the internet that could offer those services. And so if I look at the MSPs today, I'd say kind of look for 3 to 5 years as to what you would be building on top of AI as a service that you think would still be relevant. And it probably isn't, break fix on Windows, right? Maybe Windows won't even exist. Maybe they'll refactor the whole operating system and everything will run on top of AI, and that'll just be a different form factor, right? Now that's a pretty extreme pivot in 3 to 5 years, given how all the supply chains work and how people work today with all the different products they have to get through their operating system to get to. But that's how you should think about it: is what services would I layer on top of AI? And I think there's going to be some pretty interesting ones that manifest. There's still space to create, a self-driving Uber app, right? There's still
Yeah.
space to create, a robotic delivery service. There's still space to set up a home cleaning service based on, artificial intelligence. Or there's still space for that, right? We're still not the Jetsons of Star Trek, and there's still space for it. And so, as MSPs, I think look at, is there a pivot? Is there something they could do? Adopting artificial intelligence early stage might be expensive and they might have a couple of scars from it. So it's probably, frankly, still early. Half of AI is sort of bullshit anyway, is that
Yeah.
you can't really sell the outcome of the AI. They sort of tell you what their thing does instead of you telling them what it does or should do. So think about what things you would do as an MSP if you had all the time. If you had a time machine, you could hit stop and do everything you wanted to clean up today. Great. Okay. Is all that tech debt worth it? Is that going to be maintained as you have sort of AI as a service that you're going to be able to use and build on top of it? And then, lastly, if you're saying, well, how much should I dig into the technology? People are saying, computer science degree is worthless, that you got this, AI vibe coding is going to take over and all that. You have to answer the question: do you think there's going to be more technology or less? Do you think there's going to be more maintenance or less? No sign points to less, right? I have no love for somebody that says, "Oh, we're going to contract somehow in terms of the number of devices and the number of the amount of connectivity, the number of applications, the number of things that we're going to need to manage." And that just makes the MSP's job a lot harder, right? There's so many more dynamic things that you have to do, but you now have this cool new tool to help you do it. So I don't think you get out of the business. I think there's probably an interesting cycle over the next couple of years. Probably a lot of acquisition. If your books aren't ready for ARR, EBITDA, and an acquisition, get ready, MSPs, because you guys are being consolidated at the speed of light. Private equity is scooping you up. All of our biggest partners are roll-ups of former partners, right? So it's coming for you too, right? Be ready to be acquired or to do some acquiring yourself to stay around, because it's going to be tougher and tougher to compete when those books of business are going to end up going to the bigger, more margin ready, price sensitive. They can lower their prices. They can do all kinds of things that smaller guys probably won't be able to, but there's still a chance to compete. You have an ability to scale up. Now's your chance.
I think those two things are almost inextricably linked as well, like boosting your ARR by also increasing your margins using smart AI tools, thinking ahead, indeed not kind of betting all your money on a single horse. I think that's a brilliant approach, and it also shows maturity. And again, that triangle of tactical, strategic, and empathetic, where you're kind of thinking ahead and pulling people along into this next phase of the life of an MSP. I think that's really, really great advice. And a wonderful point to end this conversation. Now, first of all, I want to thank you so much for all of this, because this has been super insightful.
Thank you.
Um, Secondly, we do always ask our guests to invite the next guest on the podcast. Um, who should we have next? And you feel free to be cheeky.
Okay, so I haven't asked him yet, but I do want to nominate Chris Finan and Anishan. He is my former boss. He's great interview. Has worked in sort of government compliance, FedRAMP compliance. The defense tech space in his career. He's got a whole bunch of other accolades, and I think he's a great interview because I've spent a lot of time talking to him. So I would nominate him for the next podcast.
Amazing. Well, if he's anything like you, this is going to be a blast. Cool. Thank you so much again for sharing your thoughts and taking the time to speak with me. And yeah, to the dear listeners, thank you so much for tuning in, and see you in the next episode. Thanks, Adam.
Thank you.